be a couple of portions of time where you'll be able to do an interactive portion in the chat. And we'll open the chat at that time for you to engage in the conversation. And then the rest of the time, the team will be in the chat to collect and curate some of the questions that come up. So we'll be able to answer them at the end. Betsy, I think there were some other pieces that you were going to mention. I'm sorry, I might have jumped in a little bit.
Well, I was just going to extend a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. The Child and Family Library Services team at Arapahoe Libraries welcomes you to Parenting Strategies, Discussing Race with Young Children. We find ourselves in unsettling times, and many of us realize that we want to take positive steps to help our communities become more equitable. Or maybe we're just wanting to learn more about racial justice issues and need a place to start. And our speaker today has been with us before and in person, Janet Damon. We're so happy she was able to make the switch to the virtual experience. As she said, she's an educator, a librarian. She blogs at Mixed Mama. And she's very experienced in helping to lead conversations about race and cultural diversity, particularly using picture books as a discussion starter with young children. So Janet, we will be monitoring the chat. We'll have a formal Q&A session at the end, but if you have questions as you go along, we'll be looking, and if they seem to need to be answered right away, we'll let Janet know. Otherwise, we'll save them for the end, with the exception of these first few questions that Janet would like everyone to contribute to.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Now we're going to leave it to Janet.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. And I'm also going to mute this. So can everyone see that screen okay? Okay. If not, I think my participants will let me know. So again, my name is Janet, and I have been a librarian for and worked in libraries for 23 years. And my passion is really honoring and supporting and affirming our youngest learners. And I would like to start this evening by just offering a land acknowledgement. And so I'm going to share this one, which I find to be very beautiful. As we gather here today, we honor and acknowledge that we are on traditional territories and the ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne Arapaho nations. This area was also the site of trade, hunting, gathering, and healing for many other Native nations: the Ute, Lakota, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, and many more. We recognize the indigenous people as the original stewards of the land and all of the relatives within: the animal nations, plant nations, insect nations, and the stone nation. All of these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, and the ties these nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. Let us acknowledge also the painful history of genocide and the forced removal from this territory. We respect the many diverse indigenous people still connected to this land on which we gather. We pay our respect to them and give thanks to all tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. And this was written by Gracie Redshirt Tyron. She is the American Indian Services Director at the Center for Inclusion and Identity at CU Denver.
Janet, have you shared your screen already?
Yes, let me see. Let me just make sure.
We don't see it.
Okay, hold on. Let's come back and try that one more time. Okay. And do you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, no problem, no problem. And so that was our image. And great. Thank you for sharing and making sure that we see that. Okay, so our norms for this evening is we just invite you to be present, to have a growth mindset, and recognize that we are experts of our own story and experience. We also want in the sharing to have honoring non-attribution. So as we open up the dialogue at the end of the evening, if someone shares, and we just want to make sure that they can do so without feeling as though someone might come back and attribute that to who said that. We want to respect this as a courageous space, and also a compassionate space, both for yourself and the other participants, that we're on a learning journey and exploring this with curiosity and respect. I wanted to share this image because this is a traditional ceremony that happens on the first birthday in Korea. It's called Doljachi, and it is a ceremony to bless the child. And during this ceremony, there's objects that are put out, and the child is offered these objects. And when the child chooses one, it gives the family some idea of what are going to be the interests of this child. This is also in respect to a child having already arrived here with indwelling intelligence, and honoring who this child is, even as young as one, that they have choice and agency. And so I share that because I want us to reflect on some of the ways that we are honoring and respecting what children arrive with, and also thinking about what are the tools that we are putting in front of children to help them to navigate the world ahead. So we're gonna get started, and we have the chat open. And the first thing I want us to reflect on is share what kind of feelings arise for you when you think about talking about race with your child, but I know there's some other folks who are educators. What are some feelings that arise for you when you think about talking about race with your students, your customers, your patrons, your families? What comes up for you? And I'm gonna see if this will, and when I'm sharing my screen, my chat's a little bit, I can't see it. So if I could have one of the participants just amplify for me some of the
Things we have, I worry about saying the wrong thing, discomfort, confusion. Oh, they're coming in quickly.
Yes, good.
One person says we talk about race, importance of the words to use. I know it's important, I want to get it right, so I agree that I worry about saying the wrong thing. Wanting positive acknowledgement without the burden of racism they will experience. And one person says you have to be able to put aside discomfort and put the child first. And yeah, one person said, I feel like I'm more comfortable talking about culture more so than race.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing and being authentic and sharing some of those concerns. And we're going to look at a little bit of data, but I want to hold space and acknowledge that what you'll see in some of this data is actually what we also see in the chat, that these are very uncomfortable conversations. And at the same time, we know that they are so important. So let's just look. Did you have one more, Mary?
Oh, no.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that for me. I appreciate it. So when we look at a study that was done with 6,000 families it was Sesame Street did this study that was called Identity Matters Study. And what we see is that when you look at the parents who are never in the dark green, and then rarely in the kind of medium green, and then sometimes, so when we look down here, what we see is that, roughly we have over 60% of parents rarely or never discussing race, ethnicity, or social class with their children. Of the things that are discussed, we see that social class, race and ethnicity, we have often at the very top. So some folks are talking about, the religious traditions more often. But then sometimes is here, and we see that, when we get to, items like social class, race and ethnicity, and country of origin, that sometimes we don't have these conversations, and that, parents aren't feeling comfortable having these conversations as well. Now, when we, at the same time, look at that same study of the 6,000 parents, and we see which parents have heard at least one negative comment about their children had heard one negative comment about their identities. And then we see that in this study, what was found is that 40% of Muslim parents and 40% of Black parents and 32% of Asian parents said their child has heard at least one negative comment about their religion and or their race. And so we know that children are having these experiences, and yet there are these codes of silence around talking about and affirming culture, race, and identity with our youngest children. So how do we maneuver and position ourselves to be able to not transmit a tradition of silence and shame, but rather one that is affirming and one that is rooted in belonging? So we have this quote that I think is really powerful by Audre Lorde. And what Audre Lorde says is that it's not our differences that divide us, it's our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. And so we're gonna think about in the chat another question. Why for you is it important to talk to children about race? And so again, I'll just invite my colleagues to amplify and lift up some of those, the chat for us. So why is that conversation so important?
Okay, so some of the responses we're getting is, so they become advocates for equity. It opens up their minds just like traveling. Another comment is they have questions, be the one to guide them correctly. Another comment says, my child is mixed race and craves those conversations. I want to provide it for him and the children I work with. Another one says, because they are curious. Another is, they will work to develop an understanding of the world and we want to guide them. Another comment says, because it's real, we live in the world.
That's right, yep.
Because skin color is a fact and not something to be ignored. To understand different cultures. So children become adults who are comfortable speaking about race.
I love that one.
It's important to me because talking about race was so taboo when I was a kid, and it's been such a barrier to my ability to talk about it as an adult.
Absolutely.
That is the job of the parent. If we don't do it, they may learn from others. Children are more perceptive than we think. So if we don't talk about it, it creates an unspoken shame.
Yes. Yes, I just got goosebumps from the power of what is unearthed when we open up space in this container to have authentic dialogue. There are so many things that resonate. I'm sure they resonate with you as well. The idea that these conversations, we don't want students to feel that and internalize this inheritance of silence and these codes of silence around it. And we don't want to inadvertently transfer shame that we don't want to talk about and have these conversations. At the same time, it's important to reflect on the tools that we've been given. Going back to that child, when we think about race, culture, and identity, and all the other identities, there has been definitely codes of silence. And so right now, as we tiptoe out and we start to break down and reflect on what we've been given and what we want to pass on to make sure that children are equipped with, that takes us into this next piece. And we're gonna look at some research about children and race. So one of the powerful studies, I think, was the University of Toronto did a study with children as young as 6 months. And what they did was they showed children pictures of faces, and what they found is that children as young as 6 months show a preference for members of their own race and against members of different races. The findings are also significant because it shows that even in just the second half of a child's first year, they are already developing some race-based bias. But this bias is not a bias that is a socially constructed bias that we have around race. It is an affinity for faces that resemble theirs and their family members. And it's also a preference for them. And so what we see is that there is some the biological leaning is toward affinity towards these family members that look like us. But when Yale University, also with their Infant Cognition Center, known as the Baby Lab, they also showed that children have a rudimentary sense of justice. So when they had puppets, and they had, each puppet looked different colors, different shirts, and they had really normalized all of these different characteristics, that babies, when they had a reenactment of one puppet that was being kind, and then one puppet that was hurting that other puppet or being mean, that they showed with, as 3 months old, an 87% preference for the puppet that was being kind. And so Paul Bloom, who is an author of Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil, and a professor of psychology at Yale, says that it kind of shows that even before babies can speak or walk, they judge good or bad actions of others. So thinking about how do we build on and maintain this idea around justice as a leaning point for human nature, that we arrive here with a sense of what is right and wrong, and building on that instead of teaching children how to other. And I'm going to go into a little bit about othering and belonging. So Dr. John Powell is one of the leaders in this, and has really amazing work and ideas around how we can begin to move towards belonging. And he's, provides this framework for looking at othering. So othering happens when we start to organize and sort identity, maybe by sexuality, skin tone, race, religion, age, ethnicity, class, ability. And what it says is that we start to deny someone's full humanity based on them being less than or as a threat to the favorite group. So when we look at how we might look at ability, that we might start to see bias around who has the gender that we feel, the gender identity that we have designated as being the preferred or the approved of identity. And then when other identities show up, then those are othered, or those are separated, or those are diminished in light of what we have designated as our the affinity group. So when we look at this, this framework, we see that exclusion operates by holding space and maintaining a boundary where we have division. So we have segregation as a model of this, where one group is given access and privilege and one group is not, or multiple groups are not. And then we have inclusion, this idea that other people can be brought in, but only if they follow the rules and parameters that we have set as acceptable. So only if they take on attributes or behaviors that reflect the dominant group and that make them more acceptable in spaces. But then when we look at equitable inclusion is when we say that these are equal identities in this space, and that gives us a way to achieve belonging, that not only are you included, not only have we invited you in and set aside and ensured that there is space, but we are actually conveying a belief that you belong in this space, that this space, and that you are welcomed here in the fullness of your identity, in the reflections of your culture and your ethnicity and your gender and your orientation and your abilities. And that belonging gives us the power to truly create the space that is justice aligned, that it's aligned toward equity and inclusion in a powerful sense that is internalized and reflected in our practices. I also want to talk just in terms of when we have othering, what it does to the bodies and the minds of children as well as adults. So this is a study that was done around relational neurophysiology. And this is how we see that the social pain overlap theory confirms that when we have social exclusion, that we can actually use the same pathways that our body uses for pain to process social exclusion. So that looks like when we have set up a system where when we greet people, so welcoming people to a space, and then in one study what they did is when folks they did this in a business setting, and they actually had an activity where a ball was passed, but there was one person who just, the ball was never passed to them. That triggered, even on a small level, the same kinds of distress in the body that actually in their neural pathways that an actual punch to the gut would expose them to. And so in other studies, what they did was they said to the person who was also still being excluded, they offered a financial boon to them and said, well, when you're excluded, you'll still get extra pay. And it didn't change. It didn't change the pain that was caused. So this is a durable sense that human beings, we are hardwired for connection and belonging. And when we do not have that, that actually also can reduce our ability to have cognitive, there's a cognitive impact. So that in this study that was done by Case Western Reserve University, exposure to rejection actually led participants in the study to have an immediate drop in their reasoning by 30% and a drop in their IQ by 25%. So that takes me into how we're going to look at kind of reading for empathy, community, and compassion. And so I know I covered a lot there, and I feel like I should have had maybe a pause again for a reflection, but if it's okay, just want to ask you this question of what is it, just thinking about belonging and thinking about othering, that really resonates for you from that piece? I know that was it's powerful to think about the impacts of our actions and our words. And when we think about microaggressions and how that might be received from children or from families that we serve, to think of that is a wounding, that can cause an actual reaction in the body, a physiological reaction. So I just want to open up that chat for a couple minutes there, just say what resonates with you from that.
And I'm sure people are typing.
I know. I have that wait time of a teacher. Yes. Where fingers are moving. I am honoring the process.
First comment, consequences of actions, even mistakes. The image of othering and belonging is so powerful. It explains why I feel so rash when I think it's happening to me. Yeah. I feel bad for the person not given the ball.
Yes.
My little one has CP and gets othered all the time. It's highly emotional to think of the pain that so many feel. Reading opens up other worlds and cultures to kids who have limited experiences.
Yes.
I think a lot of us have been struggling with feelings of exclusion and isolation these past few months. I know that for me, it's often felt akin to physical pain.
Yes.
Another comment is intense. I think we've all felt othered in some way. It is definitely something we don't want to happen for our children.
Yes. I think that piece right there, just to think about that we have this precise response that is physiological, and we know the feeling of being othered, whether or not it's been because of, in growing up, there's so many experiences folks have. But when we think about the amount of othering that can happen because of, when we think about the Muslim families, that 40% had a comment made to them. But what that doesn't capture is maybe the looks, maybe the wonderings that people have shown in their actions to whether or not that's an inclusive, that's a welcoming space. So we think about the quantity of times that a person might be othered in an average event, like going to the supermarket, going to an outdoor hike, going to birding. And we see this happening across our nation where folks have maybe even deputized themselves to look at a space and pick out people they don't think belong, and then, you know, escalate a response in terms of maybe calling a police on a family barbecuing in Oakland, or, you know, a person who might be hiking or birding. So one thing that we can do is, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the resource kit, is actually practicing a little bit of mindfulness. In our own practice as people who are either caregivers or as parents or as librarians or as folks who are in a helping capacity in occupation-wise, that we give ourselves the practice of mindfulness, because it actually reduces our implicit bias. And it actually is shown to, even 10 minutes of a practice is actually, has the capacity to reduce our implicit bias, especially towards African-American men. And so it's a practice that allows us to reflect on the bias when it comes up, and ask ourselves, what story am I telling myself about this community or this person that is in front of me? And then how it gives us that breath to be able to come back to ourselves, come home to ourselves, and respond with justice and with care, and in honor of a beloved community. So just a thought there, but thank you so much. And we're gonna look at reading for justice. So how do we take these practices and move them into using stories and using diverse books to bring students together, and to see that diverse stories help children to see our shared humanity. And when we can get rooted in what is the shared humanity of this story, of this book, of this experience that I can use for children to anchor themselves in, that is powerful. And also to use stories to highlight champions of justice and equality that from all walks of life. So what we see is that when we really take a moment to gather these stories of who has pushed forward and allowed and pushed for equality and pushed for change in society when they have observed injustice, and using stories to develop some critical thinking and building on concepts of peace, freedom, justice, and injustice with children. And what we see is that just as the babies at 6 months have a rudimentary sense of justice, children, in my personal and professional opinion, have also a powerful lens on what is right and what is wrong. So how do we nurture that? So I'm going to take us through a couple of stories and ways that I've used books to be able to build that capacity for us to have conversations. And you'll notice the platform that I'm in is Sora, and I'm going to take us into one of my favorite stories. And let us see the cover of the book real quick. So Yo Soy Muslim, this story by Mark Gonzalez is a powerful story about fatherhood and about wishes for our children. And so I'm gonna read a tiny bit. It's been said, if you climb a tree to the very top and laugh, your smile will touch the sky. And if you stay there overnight, you will learn to count the stars like dreams. And I'm just gonna skip ahead to one powerful piece about there are questions this world will ask. What are you and where are you from? And there will come a day when some people in the world will not smile at you. And here's what you'll say to them this: Yo soy Muslim. I am from Allah, angels, and a place almost as old as time. I speak Spanish, Arabic, and dreams. In this beautiful story about love and about fatherhood and about their wishes for their children, you can unpack for a child that love from a parent to child is universal, that every father and every mother hopes and dreams that this world will treat their children with respect. And then you can also pause to ask, do you think sometimes that some families, they don't get the same kind of respect, maybe because of their beliefs? And, you know, children will respond to that. You know, maybe they have even seen that or witnessed that or experienced that. And that is where we can create, again, that sense of belonging and that criticality around what we're seeing in the world, and does this align with our values? And so another story I will show us is Alma. And in this story, I'll show us the cover here, and how she got her name. You know, this is a beautiful story about a little girl who asked her father, you know, why do I have such a long name, Daddy? And he said, I'm going to tell you the story of your name. And let's start with Sophia. She loved books and poetry, jasmine, flowers, and of course me. She was the one who taught me to read. And as we go into the story, she begins to tell her all about the reasons that she carries each one of her names. And here's where we can enter a conversation with our children around the power of naming and the power of knowing that other people pronounce our names, that they use our given names, and don't, when we look at some cultures where their names might be longer or might be pronounced differently, you can see sometimes that people have actually taken a child's name and said, I'm just gonna call you Adam or Al or Margie, and that's not that child's name. And sometimes there are also times when a culture or someone from, you know, in especially, you know, different, in my growing up, you know, in Vietnam, I have some friends who are Vietnamese, and what would happen in some of the classes, they would have a name that their parents had said, just give them this name and let them just call you Cynthia, let them just call you Kathy. And because it's so much easier, and they didn't want their children to be microaggression in the sense of having someone mispronounce their name. So the power of names, and I find that in education, when I do this activity with students, I ask them, where does your name come from? Why were you named with your particular name? And most young people actually have very beautiful stories about where their names come from, who they're named after. And that allows you to start to unpack this beautiful tradition of the great love and care that goes into naming our children. Again, the water protectors. This is an opportunity to talk to students about what does it look like to stand up and to take a role in defending this, you know, our environment, our community, and how is this part of a tradition in Indigenous cultures that there is a deep relationship to the land, and that when we look at the natural world, that Indigenous psychology opens up that there's always a relationship with the land, that whether or not these are traditions in Africa or in Asia or in you know, North America or in South America, that there is this bond with the land, and that is across many cultures. You know, when we look at the Irish, when we look, these are places where students can get and children can get anchored in that we give to the land, but the land also gives to us, that we can protect the land, but in many ways also the natural environment protects us. And so how do we unpack the relationships, and that's through these stories that people and culture have to the natural world as well. And then I have the big bed. And the big bed is a story that is just a fun read aloud as well, but it also allows children to see play. Some, you know, students have shared before in some classes that, you know, it's great to read about civil rights heroes, which is a phenomenal and is something that we all should do. But it's also nice to read about the funny situations that happen in life and the funny conversations that parents and children have. So stories like this as a read aloud is a way for children to see themselves and their own funny family dynamics reflected in a story that is not aligned with history and identity and the struggle of the movement, but also that families are really close and funny and have lots of unique characters, and every family has this. So again, that we can use these stories to talk about complex issues, but also talk about the circumstances that help us also build our identity. In Not Quite Snow White, Ashley Franklin, we have a character who she loves to dance and sing and to be engaging. And she also ends up in a situation where she wants to be a lead character and play Snow White. And some of the children say, wait a minute, Snow White, like that's not a good fit for you. And so in this book, she unpacks, and with, especially in a very loving space, with her father, with her mother, with her family. And it's also about body positivity. And so that's another thing that's not always talked about, is how some characters are highly represented. But when we think about our diverse characters or our diverse bodies and our diverse abilities, how are those showing up in our stories? And so last, I'll talk about we are grateful. And I use this story often with the staff to talk about vocabulary and our words. And so when we think about gratitude, that is something, again, we are anchored in our humanity, that the things that we have gratitude for and relationship to. And this story truly embodies what community is, that as you go through struggles, that communities come together and navigate those as a collective. A lot of times in our dominant society, we see a lot of individualism and a push for individual identity and competition. And yet, stories like this remind us that when we're rooted in community, that we actually have such strength in our collective, that we can learn from our elders as well as from our young people, and that hierarchies don't need to necessarily play out in the same ways, that there are hierarchies of wisdom, that we can turn to those who have lived experiences that are powerful and wise and can help guide us through challenges as well. So those are some of the books that I would say stamped as well to look at history through this lens of with powerful lessons about what it is to be anti-racist in our actions. And so, you know, when I talk about this book, I talk about, you know, the idea that we live in a container that has been designed by history, and our lives are influenced by all of those who have come before us. And yet we are also going to influence this world for those who will come after us. And so when we think about Stamped and what it means to read the stories and learn the history, there also comes a time where it plays out in our actions. So we have moments where we read something truly powerful and we take that lesson in, and then we have to reflect, well, how will I live this in my daily life? How will I practice anti-racism and anti-oppression in the actions that I carry forward in my day? And so again, this is a book that helps to equip young people to think about this, to have the language to describe it and the understanding of history to talk about it. But it also puts the work onto us to live it in our actions. And so I want to talk a little bit about a resource toolkit that of some things I want to share with you, and hopefully this will be shared out after the webinar ends. But one of the things is that the American Academy of Pediatrics has talked about the impact of racism on child and adolescent health. And so what they have acknowledged is that the stressors and the ways that these microaggressions show up on our health is that, you know, in our well-being. So when we look at when the trauma of some of the actions that have been carried out in the media, and just in terms of the violence that children may have witnessed or seen or have a peripheral awareness of, that might undermine their well-being and their sense of safety and community. And so this is, I think, a piece that we should all, as adults who are working toward creating a more just society for our children, bear witness to and recognize that this has health impacts for children. And so as we think about how we design and create spaces and experiences that are fun and enjoyable and affirming, and that push for this identity of belonging, that children can look around and see images that reflect their families, that they can see books that reflect their families. I also, Libraries for Everyone, for those librarians who are in this space, this is a great resource of webinars and articles to continue the conversation and the reflection for you. So that is also in the resource guide. And then there's also a piece for parents, as well as having the talk, things that you can use to help you talk about racism with young people, with children. The other article that I included is from The Greater Good, in Berkeley. And this talks a little bit about what I alluded to about mindfulness. So in a study, what they found was that mindfulness, if we practice it for ourselves, that it has real implications on how we conduct ourselves. And so in a study of 72 college students, they showed that people who did a 10-minute mindfulness recording demonstrated less implicit bias. And so just something to have in the back of your mind, in your toolkit, that as we know this is very stressful times and people might be showing up with greater sensitivity, greater need for us to have patience and kindness and to be able to practice this for ourselves, to have self-compassion as well, because we want to make sure that in our practices, they are sustainable. This is, as I said, it's not a race, it's a marathon. And so we want folks to be able to remain engaged and stay in this work for the long haul, because it's so beneficial for for the society that we want to manifest in the future. The other resource I want to share with you is Embrace Race. And so this is a wonderful resource for families, and it's guided towards, again, are thinking about our children of multiple identities, intersectional identities, our children who are biracial. And so this has books, it has action guides, it has articles and webinars. So this is also going to be in that toolkit, and they've been having really great webinars that I think are really well done. So that's another resource. And last, the study that I talked about earlier, the Sesame Street workshop of 6,000 families. This had a lot of information in the report around what's being talked about and what's being shared with our children, and what tools are they being given so that they can navigate these discussions with both skill and compassion. And what we see as skill is having the language to talk about it with greater specificity of what's happening to them, identifying what a microaggression is so that they can say, this hurt me, this was said and it hurt my feelings. And I think it's important to make sure that children have the language, but also that parents talk to children about communicating that with adults. And so I think that's powerful as well. And so last, there's a resource here of American Indians and Children's Literature, and this is curated by Dr. Debbie Reese of the Nabe Pueblo Nation. And so this has the best books and ways that we can make sure that the books that we're recommending and that we're getting are aligned and affirming and also authentic to the cultures that they represent. So I am going to pause there because I want to make sure that there is some time for questions and also time for Betsy to do some closing remarks. But I just want to thank everyone. I have one quote that I just want to share with you. And this is a quote by Bell Hooks. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination, against oppression. And the moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. That action is the testimony of love as practice of freedom. So.
Thank you, Janet. We'll open up the chat for everyone to put their questions in.
And I do already have some that have been asked already, if you're ready for those.
Yes.
We'd like to know again who wrote the land acknowledgement statement.
Oh, yes, yes. Let me go back and tell you her entire name. That acknowledgement statement is by Dr. Let me see. I just want to make sure I'm pronouncing it all the way correctly. Her name is Gracie Redshirt Tyron, and she is the American Indian Services Director at the Center for Identity and Inclusion at CU Denver. And that is on, so that is one that I think is just incredibly powerful, especially the Arapaho libraries. I feel like that is very, we think about honoring the land and the history of the people who were here and have honored and been a part of this land for so long.
Yes, I've heard of Canadians doing it and Australians doing it. This is the first time I've heard an American do it, so I was very excited. Let's see. Oh, we had two people ask, did the study that you were talking about in the beginning, did they look at children who have parents of different races?
I do not know that, and that's a great question. That is, you know, I wonder, because I too am biracial. My mother is Korean and my father is Black, and when I looked at that study, I wanted to bore down to see how many of the sample size were children of two ethnicities. And so, great question. I have to look up and find that answer for you.
All right. Had just one comment, like there's a, that was very relevant to what you were saying at the time, that there's a board book about opposites that also happens to feature an illustrated version of Eva Perón. And I had a conversation with a Latinx friend who felt hurt when it was read in story time without any acknowledgement of who Perón was. So what can we do when we're reading our books to make sure that the whole story is looked at?
That's a great question. And actually, I'll be honest, one of the things I think is powerful is that, you know, the author, I find, usually has a powerful story about what even brought it upon them to want to write this book. And so if possible, and especially since, you know, looking at own voices, some of the books that we're choosing, we want to make sure that that is that authenticity of who wrote this story. Is it a lived experience, or are they writing about another culture that's outside of their experience? So I think it is powerful to look up the authors that you're going to be using for story time. And maybe even if you can, take some time to watch some of the author videos of what sparked them to write the story. Because when you look at La Alma, the author of that book, when you, her name just fell out of my head, but yes, Juana Martinez Neal, you know, that story is written because of her lived experience and a conversation she had with her father and her family. And so there's just interesting stories about why folks are authors come and want to do and produce a book. So if you can, to take a little step and try to do that. And then this is the thing, it's so important. Recognize and own the fact that we are not experts in everything, that we are seeking and desiring to be in community and learning from community. So it's sometimes nice to pause even before you open a text and say, you know, this is a book that I chose because of this reason. Has anyone else read this book? Does anyone else know a little bit about this author, a little bit about this culture? Because what you'll find is there might be families, when they see that you're going to be doing a book that is about a certain culture or a certain a storyline that is about a certain identity, that is why they chose to come, is because they see that and they feel reflected in that connection. So creating a warm and welcoming space also means that we have cultural humility to say, I might not know everything about this, but I really want to learn more, and I want to do that in partnership with you. Thank you. Thank you so much for Molly, for dropping that link to the YouTube as well. Yes.
And I also did put the name of the doctor who said the statement in chat. Gracie, okay. Red shirt, tie on.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right, we had another question come in. My 8-year-old just finished a summer anti-racist book club and is having a situation with her friend who is angry that people changed the name of our neighborhood because its namesake was a member of the KKK, and that statues of quote-unquote good men have been taken down. She wants to be anti-racist, but isn't sure how to respond to her friend. Do you have any advice for her?
Well, what I would say is it's so interesting, because what is happening is that your child is developing her praxis. So at 8, she is having an encounter with the the real struggle of both advocating and also caring about people that you love and keeping her in community. So what we really want to do is invite her to kind of struggle with that a little bit, but to say, what is important to you? Your role is not always to take every friend and make them have the same opinion you do, but your role is to stand rooted in what you believe and to stand up for that. So to be able to respond to your friend and say, you know, I believe that when we have people who don't feel safe in our community because the name carries the name of a person who might have done harm to other people, that it's more important that people feel safe. It's more important that people feel welcome. It's really important to me that people can come to our community and not feel threatened. And so if she can be rooted in love and belonging and in service of that, it'll be easier for her to navigate those conversations. So, you know, we often look at things as we are set up to be in opposition. But what we're really doing and wanting to make sure is that our children are able to model what justice and equality looks like, because everyone has a different starting place, right? And so to stay rooted and grounded in her own beliefs is really what's going to be important after, in the terms of what comes about with her and her colleagues and friends. And she'll navigate that. That is a path that most people who have stood up for justice, and it's a path that you navigate. And Audre Lorde has a beautiful quote about this. And she says, you know, when you start to speak your truth, some people will go away and some people will come closer to you. And I'm paraphrasing, but what you'll find is that the only thing worse than not speaking your, you know, truth. Oh gosh, I'm messing up this quote. There's nothing worse than not speaking your truth, is what she's saying. So as long as we can get our kids rooted, that they speak their truth, the worst thing is being silent. That's the quote. The worst thing is to be silent. We have to speak our truth. And so it sounds like this 8-year-old is being equipped, and now she is living that work, right? Like now she's read these books, and it's been amazing to see this incredible surge and desire to read all of these anti-racist books. And then to put it into practice means that it's going to be just uncomfortable. And we're going to be in spaces where we feel that pressure of our own integrity calling out and wanting to be heard. And so I affirm and I celebrate your 8-year-old.
Thank you. All right. So what do you do in a situation where your child is watching or reading something offensive, said something offensive? In the moment, what do we concentrate on?
First, you want to say, where have you heard that said before? Where are you getting that? And this is developing criticality. So metacognition, when we think about our own behaviors and our own actions, it's important to plant the seed for our children to be aware. And so, for example, you know, Lady and the Tramp, that was one of my favorite record player books. I used to have a record player with the book and the little record, and I love Lady and the Tramp. And so when Disney Plus came out, I said, well, you know what, kids, let's watch Lady and the Tramp. And then an offensive song came up. And my daughter said, you liked this song? Like, this is terrible. Like, this is offensive. And I said, it is. And I appreciated her criticality. I didn't have to tell her, but she had developed this internally to say that this here, I should think about this. This is reflecting a negative and derogatory image of Asians. And so the piece of it is, you cannot, again, control all of the aspects that you will see in popular culture and in hearing music. But what we can develop is criticality, where we think about it. We think about, what is the message that is trying to be conveyed? Is this a message that creates belonging, or is this a message that creates othering? And we want them to get the ideas of, especially of othering and belonging, because we can see that played out all the time. And once they know that this is kind of a strategy being used to pull communities apart and not in service of bringing communities together, they can be more critical of that idea, and they can question it, and they can interrogate it, and they can ask those hard questions around why. And that's the kind of critical thinking we need our children to be equipped with, because the future holds so many unknowns. We just want them to have the tools and to be rooted in a sense of justice that they can carry forward in their actions.
Excellent, thank you. Those were all the questions we had. Betsy?
Oh, well, we did have a question about the slides. Will they be available?
Yes, I will. I can definitely share the slides. And so I'm happy to do that, as well as the slide at the end that has some of the links to the resources.
Okay. I just want to say a big, huge thank you for giving us this time of yours and providing the space for us to reflect and learn. I know that we've heard a lot of things that we're going to be carrying with us and thinking about for many weeks to come. Thank you to the audience for joining us. Look for an email in the next day or two that will include a request for feedback, and we would like you to consider whether anti-racist book club or something of that sort is something that you might be interested in pursuing with us at the Arapahoe Library District. So start thinking about that. And this is the 4th in our parenting strategy series. We'll have another parenting strategies program September 22nd with Colleen Burdell. And thanks again, very, very powerful program. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Talia. Thank you so much, everyone, for your kind words and for your attendance. Have a wonderful and blessed evening. Stay rooted in love.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.